Hi everybody. I'd like to begin with a somewhat provocative opening. I believe that historians are unprepared to engage with the quantity of digital sources that will fundamentally transform their trade. Web archives are going to transform the work we do for a few main reasons. First, more data than ever before is being preserved. This is both good and bad because we need to learn to program to access this material, and historians aren't there yet. Secondly, this data is going to be saved and delivered to us in very different ways. We need to understand this along the lines of both opportunity and challenge, and begin to lay the foundation for historians to recognize the importance of this shift. Most historians work with traditional archives, which are limited on a number of levels: physical space, the work of accession and preservation, acquisition, etc. This process has meant that historians are working with scant traces of the past. 99.9% of things that happen are never recorded, something which philosophically is not going to change. Events are transitory, they happen, and unless it ends up in an archive box or newspaper, they are generally lost. The problem is with these, in a word, is that of scarcity, as the late great American historian Roy Rosenzweig noted. Yet I want to hold to you today that the arrival of something new portends to change and alter the work that we do. And it is this: the WARC, or Web Archive file. It lets us bundle up thousands of websites into one single file, which we can access computationally or with the Wayback Machine. Here, for example, is the AHA, the American Historical Association, actually the Historians Committee for Open Debate, which used that historians.org URL until sometime in 2004, and here we're using it through the Internet Archive. So what does all this mean? I'd like you to imagine a future historian taking on a central question of social and cultural life in the middle of the first decade of the 21st century, such as how Canadians understood Idle No More, or the Occupy movement through social media. What would her archive look like? I like to imagine it as boxes stretching out into the distance, tapering off, without any immediate reference points to bring it into perspective. Many of these digital archives will be without human-generated finding aids, would perhaps have no dividers or headings within files, and certainly have no archivist with a comprehensive grasp of the collection contents. And compounding this actually means that historians need to get involved a bit earlier than we traditionally do, of course. Of all those Occupy Wall Street sites, created in the heat of a movement, etc., they didn't have data management plans, people's politics shifted, people fell out of the movement, didn't renew server fees, etc. And so 2 years later, Archive It, a branch of the Internet Archive, discovered that only 41% of those Occupy Wall Street sites are still active today. From this to that. I like to throw this in because it shows that we need to actively maintain our digital sources and that historians need to begin thinking about retaining the data that we generate today. If I wrote a book in 1991 and put it on a shelf in my basement and came back in 2014, chances are I can read it. And I'm pretty sure that if I created a digital object in 1991, it would be unusable. We need to actively preserve these sources. But I digress. Some of this material is going to be retained, and it's going to be retained on a massive scale. And this is thanks to the efforts of institutions like the Internet Archive and some national libraries, especially in Europe, where they have legal deposit legislation. Remember scarcity? We're in the era of historical abundance. Take Twitter, for example. During the Idle No More protests, there were an astonishing 55,334 tweets on 11 January 2013. Each tweet can be up to 140 characters. Now, I took the average length of a tweet, which is actually 60 characters, average length of a word, amount of words you can fit on a page, you can see it here, and argued that because we have to put everything into historian scale, with the cottage industry of making big numbers intelligible, if you take 55,334 tweets, and you say 300 words per page, and you put in line breaks in there, you get about 1,844 pages of tweets. Just for one day of a relatively small, on the global scale, protest movement. Almost 1,900 pages of a book for one day. Now you can't read that yourselves. If you want to study Idle No More, you can't read all of those tweets. You have to learn how to program or access them computationally. And that is why I'd hold to you that historians need to be leading the charge up the digital humanities hill. But we're not. As I noted, these sources are both a boon and a challenge to historians. If the norm until the digital era was to have human information vanish, now expectations have inverted. Everything may be recorded and preserved, at least potentially. Useful historical information is being preserved at a rate that accelerates with every passing day. Now, I think James is perhaps overstating the point here. The previous process that I outlined to you at the start of the talk, event happens, some traces of the past are left behind, historians take those little traces to write their histories. That's still true on a philosophical level, but more, emphasizing more, traces of the past than ever before are being left behind. Take this, a Usenet post from 1995, an 11-year-old boy sparking a discussion about a then relatively popular amongst nerds board game. My first trace of an online presence, using my dad's email account. Preserved in the Data News Archive, subsequently purchased by Google to put in their newsgroups archive. I study youth history, youth and childhood history, and generally kids don't leave sources. Now the problem here, you wouldn't know that this is a kid, but this kid, me, Ian, in Mississauga, Ontario, in a basement, has left a digital trace that would never have been left before. And if you scale that up, I right now on a little hard drive sitting in the corner of my room have 2 million messages from the Usenet archive just sitting in the corner. That's the biggest collection of non-commercialized public speech that you could possibly imagine. I mean, we look at the Old Bailey, 197,000 trials, and we're impressed by the breadth of that ability to look into the lives of everyday people. But by the time we get to the 1980s and the 1990s, our scale has dramatically increased. Or this, a GeoCities memorial garden, testament to people who died before their time, collected together in a personalized, meaningful way. Let's not fool ourselves. This stuff matters. Things that would never have been preserved before are, and there are unparalleled opportunities for social historians to capture the broad context of the time that they're studying. And most importantly, I want to underscore that I don't think you can do justice to the 1990s and beyond if you do not consider the web. This holds true for all branches of our historical profession. Political historians can't do justice to elections without understanding the tweets, the blogs, the websites that surround not only elections, but the everyday process of making policy, understanding public sentiment, and reaching out to the electorate on a new level. Military historians will have the voices of rank-and-file soldiers playing out on discussion boards in other parts of the web. Cultural and social historians, I think that the link is even more evident, the impact of online and offline culture playing out, the voices of everyday people that would be lost. Yes, the web is not a perfect democracy. We know that. There are many lower income people who do not have access to the web. There are age and racial cleavages as well. Those who access them on laptops, those who access the web on mobile devices now, etc. Historians need, of course, to keep this all in mind. We can't forget that. But we are still expanding our percentage of traces of the past that are being preserved, and we can't forget that either. So there's a lot of potential here and several upsides as we grapple with the shift that is affecting our profession. But there's a pitfall, and that is that, quite frankly, historians aren't ready. We can see that we're not ready if you take the Google Ngram project or the Culturomics project. There's 13 authors, Google Books team, no historians. I don't want to dwell on the negatives too much here, but basically historians are reluctant often to engage in collaborative project work. We have an overly specific focus on research monographs. We have an emphasis on looking to IT or computer science for solutions, which we should collaborate with them. But if we just uncritically use tools other people design, we create black boxes that see research going in one end and results coming out the other end, and we don't know how it works. And so we spend a lot of time looking at date-ordered keyword search results, which are not an ideal way to search through millions of results. But if that's what we get, that's what we get. And of course, no historical talk is ever complete without decrying the general limitation of grant money, although things are better in Canada than they are elsewhere. So we have potential, but the pitfalls are that we as a profession are not completely ready for what it represents. So what can we do? One major source that I'm using in my own work is the 80 terabyte wide web scrape. It's an amazing resource, the entire results of the March to December 2011 scrape of the web. And I just want to quickly go through this as an example of the kinds of archives that we need to use and what they look like. So first of all, assembling this kind of data set was not straightforward. The work files were provided in a set of roughly 85,570 files, each 1 gigabyte in size. So that's a lot of information. You can't download it all, but luckily we actually have a finding aid, and it's actually the metadata that helps power discovery tools on work tools. And so these are actually CDX files, which are arranged in a series of lines where each line is similar to this. We see it starts with a reverse ordered domain, CA, YorkU, JustLabor. The event that it keeps all the CAs together, all the YorkUs, all the JustLabors together for information retrieval purposes. We see that it was scraped on July 14th, 2011 at 7:37 or 26 milliseconds Greenwich Mean Time. We see the URL. We see that it was a redirect to actually a labor history journal or labor studies journal held at York University. And from this, I scaled it up and I created this sample looking at roughly 622,365 .ca URLs. As a comparison factor, I also used GeoCities, which by the early 2000s had a whopping 38 million websites. For many people, as archivist Jason Scott has eloquently argued, it represented their first access to a publishing platform, their first access to an audience. Now to crack these open, I have a few processes. One is I take those CDX files, I think of them as finding aids, I grab the works that I want, I crack them open using work tools, the sort of earlier version of it, run them through the links browser, and I index them into Solr. I cluster them, sort of what you see in Google News. You get 2,840 news sources on women's hockey. You can't read them all. You can look at 3, but you can dig down if you want to. And so I do the same. I take Solr, I make it speak to Caret 2, and when I run queries like here for children and youth, we can see what we have inside these files. On this visualization, each dot represents a website. The labels represent the clusters. And so if you look at the cluster between Christian education and early learning, that dot there, if you click on it, is an object that belongs to both clusters, and here we are there. The problem is you need to know what you're looking for. Keywords are limited, so I've been playing with named entity recognition. Here we're seeing locations. We use Stanford NER to grab all the locations, clean them up with Google Maps and a research assistant, and here we're seeing countries that were mentioned in this scrape. Traditional trading partners, US and Western Europe, of course, Russia, China, Brazil, conspicuous absences in sub-Saharan Africa. Here are provinces, Quebec underrepresented. Here is .mil. We see Afghanistan looming large, .gov, .edu, the .uk. And we can do regular expressions to also look at Canadian postal codes. And the next step for all of these visualizations that I clicked through very quickly is to get longitudinal data. Let's go back to 1996. Let's see how postal codes flow. Let's see how locations change. Let's see what we can learn as historians from this biggest archive that we can ever imagine. It raises tons of problems as well. Many of the websites I'm using, people didn't know they'd be archived. There's no donor agreement. There's no consent necessarily. They just didn't change a line on a robots.txt file that sits on the server that they probably didn't control. And so for this, I don't have much time as the timer in my screen clicks down, but I find myself often not looking to traditional sources of ethical knowledge, which are oral history based in history, but to those who do live web research and trying to balance questions of scale, what are the implications of me studying millions of people versus honing in on one person's individual site, and also expectation of privacy. If they had a hit counter and link structures that brought people from all over the world and a guest book that was widely populated, I feel more comfortable writing about it than a very narrow slice of the web that I only found because it was hoovered up by a scraper that I probably wouldn't have found otherwise. So I want to make 4 main points in my conclusion. The first one is that this is coming. It's a train coming down the track. The amount of data is going to grow and grow and grow, and historians need to work with it. So it's coming. Number 2, we're not ready as a profession. Historians aren't ready because of our professional structures that focus on research monographs, that mitigate against meaningful collaboration, and a pedagogical approach that I didn't mention today that downplays the importance of math, statistics, and computing. So it's coming, we're not ready. Number 3, we can do some great things, as I hope I'm teasing today. There's a lot of potential in these files. And that 4, if we don't do it, if historians don't study this, other people will. Computer scientists will. Other disciplines will. And historians who have a long-developed profession of studying the past are going to be marginalized unless we learn how to deal with big data and web archives. Thank you very much, and I wish I could be with you, but I'm at a conference in California today, but I really hope that you enjoyed this presentation. Thanks very much.